Do you find yourself free, authentic, capable of deciding your life with full conscience? It may seem hard to say that, but you may not be as free as you think. Perhaps much of what you call personal choice is being guided by an invisible, old, silent structure, an archetype. Carl Jung said that archetypes are forms without content that live in the collective unconscious, shaping behaviors, emotions, and even destinations, even when we have no idea of it. They are inherited psychic patterns that inhabit the human mind as primordial models: the hero, the rebel, the caregiver, the wise, the innocent, the lover, the ruler, the outlaw, among many others. But what no one told you is that you have a dominant archetype, a symbolic force that acts as a silent lens between you and the world. You carry it in everything, in the way you love, work, fight, dream, procrastinate, dress, and even get sick. She is her invisible mask. And the most dangerous? Almost always you believe this mask is who you really are. The archetype is not just a role you play. It is an unconscious matrix that defines the script of your life. If you don't recognize you, it controls you. But if you see him, he begins to lose the power to dominate you. Only there is a detail. Seeing it requires courage. Because discovering your dominant archetype is finding that perhaps many of your attitudes didn't come from you, but something you were just repeating automatically. The mask protects, but also hides. And only those who have the courage to face what is behind it can indeed start living. Discovering its dominant archetype is not an intellectual exercise. It is a shake, an internal earthquake that destabilizes the certainties you have built on yourself throughout your life. Because deep down, everyone has a script, a role that is learned to play, sometimes since childhood. The exemplary son, the tireless caregiver, the inconsequential rebel, the silent wise, the irresistible seductive, the martyr who suffers in silence. You may not know the name, but have been acting on this paper for years. When you start to see this pattern clearly, something breaks. Jung said the process of individuation, becoming who one is, begins with the rupture of the persona, this mask built to survive socially. But behind the mask, freedom does not immediately come. Comes the emptiness, the discomfort, the instability of not knowing who you are anymore or what you really want. It's like you've lived half of your life sleeping, and someone suddenly woke you up with a slap. And so many escape from this investigation, because the dominant archetype not only reveals its brightness, it reveals its wound. What you try to hide even from yourself, it shows the blind spot, emotional rigidity, the unconscious addiction, the injured child who screams behind adult behavior. This recognition can be dizzying, but it is also liberating, because what is not seen governs you. But what is seen with lucidity begins to dissolve. The shock of finding out who you really are with all your repetitions and hidden pains is the beginning of something new, a less automatic life, more awakened, more yours. One of the biggest mistakes when talking about archetypes is treating them as fixed characters, as if they were personality test labels. But archetype is not a caricature. It is a symbolic, deep pattern that structures the human soul since the oldest times. Jung saw archetypes as universal expressions of the collective unconscious, forces that are present in all cultures, mythologies, and stories. They are not invented by us. They are discovered, revealed by the way we live, dream, and react to the world. The hero, for example, is not just the brave warrior of legends. He is the urge to face fear, to overcome internal challenges. The sage is not only the old man with a staff, he is the search for truth, for clarity. The caregiver is not only those who serve others, but who needs to be necessary to feel loved. Each archetype is an internal architecture, a way to perceive, feel, and act. And here is the detail that destabilizes. These standards act even when we are not aware of them. You can spend a lifetime thinking you are making free decisions, when in fact you are just obeying an archetypal script. What seems your way can be just the unconscious reflection of a symbolic energy that has taken the steering wheel of your life. And the more unconscious this force is, the more it dominates you. Because the archetype doesn't ask if it can enter. He already lives there. When you recognize the archetype as a soul pattern, not as a label, you start to understand why you repeat certain cycles, why always attract the same kind of relationship, why always sabotage at the same point, why does it carry guilt that cannot explain. And this recognition is the beginning of reintegration. Because archetypes should not be overcome, they must be understood. When you look at your dominant archetype honestly, you start to see yourself in depth, not as a character but as someone who is finally awakening. No archetype is pure. They all have a hidden face, a shadow that grows when you identify yourself with the mask it offers. The shadow of an archetype is its excess, its imbalance, its symbolic addiction. It is the point where what seemed virtue turns into prison. The hero, for example, can become obsessed with saving everything and everyone and end up sacrificing himself. The caregiver can live on others, forgetting himself until he's sick from silencing his own needs. The wise, if inflated, becomes a cynical. The rebel, a compulsive destroyer. The lover, a prisoner of grace. When an archetype dominates your psyche and you merge to him without conscience, he takes over. And what should be strength becomes compulsion. What should be expression becomes rigidity. Jung called this an archetypal inflation, when the individual no longer sees himself as a person but as a role. He no longer feels he represents. He lives within a narrative that no longer knows where he ends. This is why recognizing your dominant archetype is just the beginning. The real work is to see the shadow it carries. This shadow is not a moral defect. It is the excessive identification, the attachment to the paper, the unconscious repetition of attitudes that no longer serve, but still there because you think it's just your way. The archetype that is not seen becomes prison, but the archetype that is illuminated becomes a bridge between what you have been and what can finally start to be. The dominant archetype trap is that it works. It works so well that you don't realize you are stuck in it. It works at work, in relationships, in your public image. It works because it meets the expectations of the world, because it gives you recognition, meaning, routine. But it has a cost, and this cost is silent. Gradually, what began as a force, the heroes. Courage, the caregiver's sweetness, the rebellion of the outlaw, the intelligence of the wise, becomes an automatic mechanism that makes decisions for you without you. And the more you invest in this standard, the more difficult to abandon it, because that's where your safety zone is. This is where you have learned to be accepted. You become functional, but deeply exhausted. And this exhaustion does not appear right away. It is disguised as emotional tiredness, chronic discouragement, relationships that lose their shine, a strange feeling of always fulfilling a role, but never really inhabiting one's life. You start to ask yourself, why do I repeat the same standards? Why do I always explode with the same things? It is the archetype asking for too much space. It is your soul telling you, this structure no longer serves you. But getting out of this is afraid, because giving up the dominant archetype is often giving up everything that brought you here. It is to stop being the reliable, the independent, the protector, the funny, the strong, the sensible, which solves everything. And here comes the conflict. If you are no longer this, who are you? That question hurts, because it uninstalls. And no one wants to be uninstalled with you. But here is the key. It is exactly in this void that something new can be born. When the archetype begins to crumble, it is because your soul is ready for something more authentic, for a way of living that is not just functional but true. Disassembling the symbolic arrest of the dominant archetype is not to destroy who you are. It is rebuilding, with conscience, with choice, with freedom. It is at this point that the script of life begins to cease to be repetition and becomes reinvention. Before becoming mental clarity, the archetype screams in the body, and most of us have learned to ignore this scream. Have you ever felt drained after playing the same role every day? Have you ever felt a subtle anguish by repeating behaviors that theoretically work, but internally sound false. Have you ever had that feeling of watching your own life happen like an automatic character inside you? This is no coincidence. It is the body warning that there is a symbolic imbalance. Carl Jung said that symptoms, whether emotional or physical, are messages from the soul that we cannot translate into words. And when a dominant archetype takes over our psyche, the body suffers the consequences of this. Excess. The caregiver who never allows himself to rest may develop chronic pain, anxiety, extreme fatigue. The hero who lives on a state of constant warning may have insomnia, hypertension, muscle tension. The wise man who disconnects himself from emotions in the name of reason may face creative blockages, feeling of stagnation, breathing disorders. This is because archetypes do not live only in the psychological field. They shape our posture, our rhythm, our metabolism. And here is a disturbing detail. The body always knows when we are living a character that we are no longer. You may be smiling at the world, but the body is tense. It may be pleasing everyone, but the stomach is sick. It may be handling everything, but the chest is tight, and we think it's stress, PMS, gastritis, fatigue. But sometimes it's just the tiredness to interpret. Therefore, recognizing its archetype is not an intellectual exercise. It is visceral. It is a dive into sensations, memories, impulses. It is paying attention to times when the body relaxes spontaneously and at times when it locks without explanation. The body is the first to react when the soul is not being heard, and it is also the first to thank when we begin to integrate truly what we are inside with what we show on the outside. Listening to your body is listening to your unconscious, and maybe he's been telling you for years that the role you assumed is no longer who you are. A moment comes from the journey when you realize the archetype that defines you the most is also what has hurt you the most. And this is where everything is complicated, because what seemed strength begins to reveal itself as a reaction, a defense, a shield that was erected not by choice, but out of necessity. The dominant archetype is often built on an old wound. The caregiver may have learned to nullify himself to deserve love. The hero may have needed to be strong because no one else has been. The wise may have plunged into the world of ideas to escape an emotionally chaotic environment. The rebel may have fought against everything because it was deeply injured by some authority. The lover may have become seductive because one day he felt invisible. The wounded archetype is not an invention. It is a coded emotional response, a symbolic adaptation to a trauma, to an absence, to a rejection. And as much as he protected you, at some point he began to limit. He became armor, and like all armor, weighs. It prevents touch, hug, vulnerability, prevents lightness. The encounter with this injured archetype is not pleasant, because he carries the most intimate pain in his story, the one you learned to hide even from himself. But it is also at this point that the power of transformation resides. Jung said, "What you need most will be in the place where you least want to look." The wounded archetype, when seen with courage, begins to heal. You no longer need to be strong all the time. No need to please everyone. You don't have to shine always. No need to escape who you are to be accepted. Because where your pain is, your power is also. A power that is not to overcome others, but to reintegrate, to break free from the repeated pattern, to live in depth, with wholeness, with authenticity. This is the moment when the archetype is no longer prison and becomes a passage, the symbolic crossing between your version that reacted and the one that now consciously chooses how to live. At the end of this journey, a truth reveals itself with painful and liberating sharpness. The archetype is not who you are. It is just part of what you carry. He may have been his armor, his shelter, his flag. You may have guided you, protected you, defined you for years, but it cannot be your destination. Jung teaches us that the goal of psychic development is not to become the best hero, the best caregiver, the wisest among the wise. The real way is that of individuation, the process of integrating all parts, lights and shadows, virtues and addictions, masks and truths. To be whole is to be paradoxical. It is to accept that in you coexist the leader and insecure, independent and needy, rational and impulsive, and that there is nothing wrong with that. The problem is born when you cling to one paper and try to build a lifetime on it, because a role does not support a soul. This is why discovering your dominant archetype can destabilize you so much, because it shows you that so far you have lived more to protect yourself than to express yourself. But this discovery is also a key, because once you recognize the archetype as a symbol and not as a fixed identity, you gain freedom. Freedom not to react in automatic. Freedom to allow other ways. Freedom to fail, to change your mind, to try other versions of yourself. The archetype at this point becomes door, a passage between the survived version and the one that finally begins to live. And this is where true life begins. Not that, based on external expectations, nor the social persona, nor in the compensation of wounds, but a life lived from the inside out, consciously, responsibly, and with truth. This is the journey of archetypal self, knowledge, not a map to fit in, but a mirror to break free. Because in the end, as Jung said, we are not what happened to us, we are what we choose to become. The journey of discovering its dominant archetype is not about fitting, it is about liberation. You are not here to be just a functional version of yourself, shaped by wounds or expectations of others. It's here to become whole, to integrate what was repressed, illuminate what was denied, heal what was ignored, and that doesn't happen overnight. It is a process, a gradual return inward, a detachment of repeated papers, a silent courage to see and allow yourself to be. If this video confronted you, teased you, or just made you think, maybe you're ready to take this step. Comment down here. What archetype did you recognize in you? And which part did you hurt you most to realize? Share this video with those who need to get out of the autopilot of the story itself. Short, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because here, we don't live on the surface. We dive into the bottom of our soul. We see each other in the next episode. And until then, allow yourself to change skin.